Radio, your number one online Islamic talk station.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Straight Talk on Middle Path Radio. Welcome back. Just to let you know, we were in a break for 10 minutes. Those of you who've just joined us, and inshallah, in the future shows, we will be taking this 10 minutes break due to Maghrib Salah. But we will try to cover that time at the end of the show, inshallah. So, Jazakallah khair for joining everyone. Today's discussion is on Brussels attack. Following the recent terrorist attack in Brussels, in which 35 people died, questions have been raised regarding immigration, Islam, and of course the war on terror. A lot of people have been discussing this on the media, etc. And a lot of Muslims are discussing also as to how to react and what not to say, what to say, etc. Tonight, we have two guests in the studio, inshallah, Brother Nizal, Hussain and Abdus. Assalamu alaikum. If you could briefly explain exactly what happened in Brussels a few weeks ago, how come the media and the politicians argue that these terrorists have attacked their way of life, their ideology? If I could ask Nizal.
Okay, so first of all, 3 bombs went off in Belgium's capital, Brussels. 2 at Zaventem Airport and 1 at Molenbeek Station. So these 3 bombs they exploded in Brussels. Daesh took responsibility and declared the attack as a response to the US-led war over Iraq, which Belgium was also involved in. So that's first of all the reality. Across the media outlets, it's been suggested this isn't just an attack on Belgium as such, it was an attack on Europe in general. And we see why, because of the position of Molenbeek within Brussels. There's a few European Commission centres there. But when we look at the reality in a bit more detail, you begin to see that there's various European Commission headquarters around there, such as trade and agriculture, or human aid, and legal support and things like this. And all these commissions, they're actually quite far away from the Molenbeek station. The one that's closest by is 170 metres away. So the chances that the terrorist attack aimed at hitting EU centres, it's possible, but it would be very amateurish to assume they thought they could attack the EU centres when they exploded their bombs and did their attacks within the train station, which is 170 metres away. And no attempt was made by any of the suspects to leave the station to actually run towards the European Commission centres.
Jazakallah khair. Abdus, a lot of people are saying, look, these terrorist attacks must have been the Muslims, because Muslims are the ones who are interested in seeking martyrdom. Yeah, a lot of people say it has to be Muslim. I mean, how would you answer this question?
First of all, I understand what Brother Nizal has just clarified, if you like, the backdrop in terms of how things have unfolded in Brussels. And previously we've seen similar attacks in like Paris and so on. But really, this to me is yes, the Western and the media narrative. But what I find very interesting is the way the whole situation was actually covered in the media. Now, for example, the attack that took place in the airport, for example. Now, looking at an airport in the West, in Europe, you would expect like every inch of that facility, that place to be covered by CCTV and all these other things. But what we find is that a very sort of like limited sort of images and videos that were actually presented in the media across the board. And similarly, we saw with Paris attack as well, and really for me, you can call me a conspiracy theorist, but really it raises a lot of suspicion, not just for me, but even a lot of other people have questioned the media narrative. And then on the back of that, you'll find that the Western politicians are actually pushing a political agenda to really,
So why is it they say that, it's attack on the way of life. It's only it's a physical attack to destroy some people's lives.
Look,
but why is this an attack on their way of life? Because a lot of media in the media outlets and politicians do say that this is an attack on our way of life. Why do they say that, Nizal?
Well, what's interesting is one of the attacks which took place in Molenbeek station. The media narrative focused a lot on the fact that it was relatively close by to a European Commission centre. But the reality is, like many other terrorist attacks before, and including this one, they target places of symbolic relevance, but they never actually target areas which are strategic. So even if there was ever an attempt by those terrorists to leave a station to target the European Commission centre, and there's various centres, so there isn't just one European Commission headquarters as such, there's several within the area. Even if there was an attempt to target this area, and even if they succeeded, this wouldn't bring Europe to its knees economically, militarily, or strategically in any other shape or form.
But the France attack, the attack in Paris a couple of months ago, that was an attack on any public buildings, if you like. They were still saying that as well, isn't it? I mean,
with Paris, there was an attempt to attack one of the stadiums, and with that, there was. Even if we ignore the fact that a Muslim security guard managed to stop the attack outside the stadium, if he had failed, and if the terrorist attack actually achieved and it hit its target, it's not a strategic. Obviously, there'd be a loss of life. But as you see with a lot of these terrorist attacks, you're talking about 35 with the Brussels incident. But with the Paris attack, fair enough, it was in the 130, which is quite, a lot more. But with all these attacks, strategically, they never pose a solid threat to Europe as such, or even to the US. But they always hit something that's symbolic and creates a lot of media frenzy. It usually produces, and this is a phrase that doesn't really exist, but it should be brought forward, and that's secular Western fanaticism. The Muslim world all too often gets accused of this. If you see countless of lives, hundreds of thousands of lives, over 450,000 lives have been lost in the Iraq War, possibly more. Actually, it is more, but those are just the conservative estimates by the US itself. There's always a shock and surprise as to why there's so much, there's an anger towards the Western world. But at the same time, at the drop of a hat, if 35 people die or 130 people die, there's no sense of proportionality. There's no sense, there's almost selective outrage that lives in one region of the world is worth more than lives in another region of the world.
Jazakallah khair. Just to remind the listeners, you can call in or text us on 07477 080248. You can raise any questions or comments about the discussions we're having today. So please don't forget to call in or text us.
Immediately following after the Brussels incident, there was several bombs that exploded in Ankara and Istanbul.
Right.
And we hardly saw any coverage on the media, and those that actually perpetrated those attacks were secular nationalists. Now, again, so the way they covered
there's an inconsistency in the
of course. So somehow like terrorism that is in the name of anything other than Islam is somehow justified or somehow not as bad as terrorism in the name of Islam. So again, this highlights what Brother Nizal just mentioned. It's like the selective outrage and labeling Islam or criminalizing Islam or linking Islam to terrorism has been the main focus and the goal of the politics of Europe and America.
But you say that, but a crime is a crime, irrelevant of whether they cover
exactly.
Ankara or not. Nobody gives the right to the terrorists to go and attack the people of Brussels.
Absolutely, yeah. So like, this is why we say, in Islam, for example, we see human lives as human lives. We care for human lives. And any loss is a loss.
Jazakallah khair.
But this same cannot be said for the Western media, for example, the way it's covering the different events, and all the Western politicians. And there seems to be a political agenda behind all of this, which leads me to further believe that these sort of events could possibly be even orchestrated by the West for its own political gains. I mean,
but you don't have no evidence of that, isn't it?
That's right. So we don't have no evidence, so we just have to take the narrative that is pushed, and based on that. But even based on that, if we were to discuss, we can see hypocrisy, in the way that it is covered, and we can see a political agenda that is being driven to radicalize the population against Islam and create a bad name for Islam and Muslims.
Since 9/11, 2001, it's clear that we live in a very dangerous world, irrelevant of which country we live in. What are the main reasons and causes for this, Brother Nizal? Because as you see, it's not just in Europe. It's happening in Pakistan, for example. Recently, there was an attack in the fun fair, isn't it? And other places as well. So it's not just targeted towards European countries. It's everywhere in the world. The world has become a very, very dangerous place.
The world is certainly a more of a dangerous place. But as always, we need to put things into perspective. When you say the world is a dangerous place, we're talking about the Western world.
We're not safe, basically. We're not safe.
It's not safe, no, you're right. And that includes the Western world, but it also includes the Middle East, North Africa, and various other countries in the world. But if you were to simplify the situation, which is always a daunting task to do, you can see that in the Western world, and we have to develop a sense of proportionality. This is really important. The danger in doing so, though, is you can always be accused of siding with one side. You could be biased and things like this. But looking with a sense of proportionality, you see the casualties in one region of the world is incredibly high. With the war on terror, whatever the justification of the wars, whether it's to remove Saddam Hussein, remove this leader, remove secular leaders, and deal with terrorist groups and whatnot, you find the world is more of a dangerous place, but it's probably more of a dangerous place for people living in the Middle East. I would rather be Bob and Dave living in London, or Mohammed living in London, than being Ali who works in a shop in Baghdad.
How is that? Can you explain that?
Because whatever the reality is, whatever happens, whatever the politicians say, the reality on the ground, as they call it, the Arab street, the civilians there, they face a reality that's far more threatening to them than over here. I mean, in spite of terrorism in the UK, terrorism in the US or Brussels, France, just statistically, you can even see that you have more, and people use these stats in a mocking way, in a joking way, but there's a suggestion of something very serious here. People in the Western world are more likely to die from fireworks, elevators, choking, lightning, car accidents, heart attacks, prescription painkillers, cancer. 1 in 3 people in their lives in the UK will contract cancer. But 1 in 3 people in the UK, most likely, and I'm quite confident in saying this, will never die of terrorism. It's not as there's no doubt terrorism is a threat in our day and age. But the aftermath of the Iraq War, which was led by the US, led the rise of ISIS, whose top commanders are essentially commanders of the Fedayeen, the Republican secular guard of Saddam Hussein. So I'm not necessarily pointing out conspiracy theory that ISIS are a byproduct of the US. I'm certainly not saying that. But the US left fertile grounds for ISIS to come about. And the biggest victims of that form of terrorism is actually not people in Paris. Fair enough, 130 have died. But it's the people living in the Middle East.
But sometimes, you talk about ISIS. There are some think tanks in America, even American analysts and think tanks who say that ISIS, as you say, is a byproduct of the war in Iraq. And that's because, just wanted to clarify for the listeners, because the media says sometimes they maintain that, look, it's the ISIS have claimed responsibility for this XYZ. How should people? There's nothing to really verify that statement or that claim. How should the listeners really view this? Because do they just blame the ISIS, and is that it? We don't justify the actions of ISIS or anyone who commit terrorist activities. Yeah. Just wanted to clarify that. Can you?
The way you can verify the best way you can verify is it's essentially to go directly and hear it from the horse's mouth, essentially. So with ISIS, they have various propaganda platforms, and I believe it's one of their platforms. I think it's called Merc, and it's a website, and they claimed ownership of the attack, but the key thing here is consistency. Because on the one hand, politicians have said that ISIS have claimed responsibility based on this website, which is from ISIS. But then the question arises that, well, why are the terrorists doing that? Not just ISIS, ignore ISIS, but any time there's an attack, say, for example, of Lee Rigby, the killing of the British soldier in London, at the hands of a man who, after he attacked and killed the British soldier in a horrific way, he never left the scene. He never ran away. He didn't run away. He wanted to be caught. He wanted the police to catch him. And while he stayed there on the streets, he actually preached to the people why he did what he did. And essentially, his motive was entirely political. Now, the issue is this: we need to be consistent. The politicians need to be consistent. On the one hand, they say that Bin Laden did 9/11, which fair enough, because he owned up to it. He said he did it himself. He said he didn't do it directly, but Al Qaeda claimed responsibility. Now the issue is this: when the groups claim responsibility, they also say the reason why they do it. And what we find is, with Western media outlets, they'll bring all the intellectual, experts and whatnot, will ask these deep questions. Why are the terrorists attacking us? Why are they doing this? Is it because they're socially underprivileged? So you get the sociologists who give their 2 cents. Then you get the military strategists who come up with their reasons. But you should get it from the horse's mouth directly. If a person who's admitted to doing, or the group who have admitted to carrying out the attack have said so, then surely if they're telling us the reason why they're doing it, so in the case of Lee Rigby, the man who did the attack, he stood there, blood in his hands, saying why he did this. Now ISIS in the Ahmaq website, they've claimed why they've done it. They've said they've done it because of Belgium's support of America's attack on Iraq's territory, which ISIS happened to rule over at that particular time. So I think the way the media and the politicians, they try and reanalyze things, there's no need. They're trying to overcomplicate the issue.
Yeah, but why are they reanalyzing is the real question. It's because what I understand is that they have this agenda. I mean, all we can see over the last decade, their interference and their involvement in destabilizing the entire Middle East, killing millions of innocent people, and securing their interest, trying to sort of like install their sort of like puppets in order to serve their interests, and this is their goal. And whatever issue arises, whether it be Brussels or Paris, they will use these things to radicalize their people, to justify their activities, what they're doing in the Middle East and in the other parts of the world. And this is the reason why they are not willing to take it, like Brother Nizal says, from the horse's mouth. They don't want to listen. They just don't want to understand, or they don't want to know what these reasons are. Rather, they would link it to Islam and not political grievances or political injustices. They will, try and link it to Islam, and then they will try and sort of like sell it to the people that the more Islam you have, the more threat of terrorism there is. And that in itself is false, because the fact remains is the vast majority of acts of terrorism in the world is actually very few attacks in truth are actually linked to Islam and Muslims, while the vast majority of the attacks are other groups of people, other political right-wing, nationalists and so on and so forth. But like I say, because these events never make it to the media, or they don't make the headlines, and this is why there's the impression that is generated is something completely to distort the reality.
But how can you then blame the people who are listening, watching media outlets who promote this? They may not be intellectually as high to think outside the box, some of them, in terms of what advice, Nizal, would you give them? Because they are seeing it from the politicians. So whenever another act of terrorism happens, they say, oh, it's the Muslims. Some Muslims say that, non-Muslims are saying that, because that's what they're getting in the media. I've just got to stop because I've got just a call from some. I've just got a caller. Good evening, caller. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Yes. What's your name?
My name is Naz.
Assalamu alaikum, Naz. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you doing?
Alhamdulillah. Jazakallah for the call in. What would you like to say?
Yeah, no, I was just listening to the show, and I thought it was some very interesting points that your guests were making. I myself, do some like dawah work with various organizations, and I think one of the important things is that, yes, we work to dispel these myths that often are being portrayed in the mainstream media. And actually, if the facts in regards to terrorism or terrorist acts are often hidden away from the mainstream public. I mean, I'll just give you one example. And I did this as a part of a dissertation for a qualification I was doing, and I'm looking into the subject. David Anderson, a QC of Independent Reviewer of Terrorism Legislation, he wrote about, or he did a review of terrorist acts, and he mentioned very clearly that, yes, while there may be a risk posed by terrorism, and in that time, this was back in 2012, he obviously mentioned that Al-Qaeda, that was a risk related to terrorism in the United Kingdom, that it shouldn't be overstated. And he actually did an interesting piece of analysis, which is that if you were to look at the annualized deaths, for different reasons in the UK, then it works out that there are 5 deaths caused by terrorism in England and Wales over the period of time in the 21st century. And if you compare that to, for example, there are more than 17,000 accidental deaths in the UK, including something like over 100 deaths caused to cyclists in traffic accidents. 29 or so people die each year in the bathtub, and he equated the number of deaths caused by terrorism, which was 5, to the same number of deaths caused by stings from hornets, wasps, and bees. So we can see that while terrorism is something that does affect people, and obviously is a concern for Muslims and non-Muslims alike, we need to look at this whole issue, like you say, in the bigger picture.
But are you saying? Can I just interrupt you, because just for the benefit of the listeners, Nazrul, if they could argue, are you trying to, from what you've said, fair enough, but are you trying to then pacify this problem of terrorism? Are you saying this is a trivial matter for the people? It is a problem, isn't it? I mean, so why are you trying to pacify it, as it were, by explaining and justifying with all the other figures you've given?
Yeah, I what I'm trying to say is that we need to look at the facts and assess the facts as they are. Of course, terrorism has or the killings in Brussels, or in the past in London, or like I said, in France, in Paris, they all have probably other more significant impact as well than just the deaths and the loss to the family members of those who have died. Of course, the ramifications of those incidents are far greater and are political, and there are political ramifications that we should all be aware of. But I think in terms of for our Muslim community, what's important is that we don't also just accept and we just take lying down the media and the government agenda, which is really, like some of your speakers have already mentioned, really to try and put an ugly face to Islam, to try and make the idea of even a political Islam something which is untouchable, really. And, all of us, vast majority of Muslims around the world, in the UK and elsewhere, we have no affiliation to or any acceptance of those types of acts which kill innocent people. This is something clearly forbidden and unacceptable in Islam. The government and the media sometimes try to portray as though this is an Islamic act or caused by Muslims in the name of Islam. It gives an impression that this is somehow something that we as Muslims we accept, while we don't. But what we do accept, and this is what's important, is that Muslims do accept, and the vast majority of Muslims, again, there are reports and research done on this issue, the vast majority of Muslims in the Muslim world and even in European countries would like to see Islam being applied and governments and societies living comprehensively, by the Islamic system. But what's happening is that we see this mix and this muddle trying to be made in the minds of Muslims and non-Muslims in regard to this type of unacceptable violence and really what you might call political Islam as being one and the same, while in reality they definitely aren't. And I can just finish on
Jazakallah khair. I have to stop you. Thank you very much for your call. I will have to stop you there because I've got a lot of other questions being raised on the text. Jazakallah for joining us, Brother Nazrul. Assalamu alaikum. So if I've got a couple of texts here. I won't be able to read all of them. One of them is saying, not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims. Do you think not that the Muslims community need to come out and admit that, Abdus Samad?
Well, this is obviously false. I mean, just citing the statistics will prove that otherwise. But these are just, phrases that have been coined up by these people with political agenda to really, demoralize and blame Islam and Muslims, really. But the point maybe I'd like to make is I think maybe we need to focus more on what the West's agenda is in the Muslim world, and what because what we see is that the West in the past has colonized the Muslim world and so on and so forth, and it has maintained a grip and a control over the Muslim world. What we have seen as well is that the Muslim world is now ready to sort of liberate itself truly. And it has realized very clearly that only through Islam, because it has tried in the past, it has tried other systems, other ways to sort of progress, if you like, in this new age. But all of it has led to much failure in the Muslim world. And what has happened is that there's been an increase in the sentiments or connecting back to Islam again, because it is only through Islam that they feel that they will truly liberate themselves, break the shackles of Western interference and dominance over their parts of the world.
You keep saying that. You keep saying that's very sloganistic, because
it's not
people come here. People come here. They say, look, we couldn't have expressed our free views and free views. We couldn't channel our views and opinions if we were in Muslim countries.
That's exactly the point. So we see. This is exactly what the West. This is exactly.
You're allowed to say this because you're in this country.
Can I just finish? This is exactly what the West has left after it has managed to dismantle Islam.
But surely the people over there wanted them to go.
What we're saying is, in the Muslim world, we actually don't have Islam. It's the lack of Islam that is creating this situation where people are not free to express themselves. Where
who created this? Your government?
No, it's not. It's not. It's actually Western agents And this is not. I mean, this is a fact, isn't it? So what the West has done. So and there's this agenda to reform Islam as well in the West as well. You'll find that they're putting a lot of pressure on the Muslim community to abandon certain aspects of Islam and talk about certain aspects like jihad, for example. These things shouldn't be discussed. These things should be reinterpreted. Certain aspects of Islam need to be reinterpreted to fit the modern age, and so on and so forth. Now, what we're looking at in the Muslim world is a reformed Islam, is an Islam that has been reformed by the West through its colonial occupation, and then they managed to educate a group of Muslims who have abandoned Islam and are willing to represent Western interests and Western values. And in this climate, in this situation, in this political climate, you will find that, yes, Muslims are being suppressed by their rulers. Muslims they don't have the free speech. Yes, we do appreciate the fact that here we can sit in the West and we can discuss a lot of these things, but in the Muslim world, you're right, you can't do that. Now, but the people want that. People want to be free, and they have realized that it's not going to come through dictatorship or kingship or even the pseudo democracies that the West has left there.
Thank you. I've got a text from another listener. He's saying, "Why did IS bomb Brussels if Brussels did not bomb IS?" For Nizal.
Okay. First of all, a quick answer to do with that. Essentially, with Brussels, Belgium was involved. Belgium was one of the allied countries with the US in bombing IS territory in Iraq. So that's simple as that, really. Right, so that's
the media and the government have taken advantage of terror attacks to promote their own objectives and agenda. How should the Muslim community living here in the UK and abroad respond to such government narrative?
Well, to do with that, what I would say is there's a strong climate of fear at the moment, and it's been going on for a few decades now, particularly in the Muslim community, but also in the non-Muslim community living in the West. The dominant flavour for the Muslim community has always been one of be non-controversial, be apolitical. Try not to get involved in this. We find this to be the general culture within the masjids. We find this to be the general culture within youth groups and whatnot. So every strata of Muslim society, every strata within the Muslim community has always toed the line, and that's always been the case. You find masjids who they've bent over backwards. Some key.
Can you blame them? They're living in this country, and you have only 2 million Muslims in this country. If we talk controversial, if we expose the British government, for example, our masjid will be closed, our community centre will be closed. Can you blame them in that climate of fear? What else can they do?
Okay, well, first of all, with the reality of, the masjids who they've had to make compromises and whatnot, with all of this, in spite of that, whenever you have documentaries on BBC, on TV programs that talk about radicalisation, they would film these most iconic masjids, the very same masjids who are abiding by all the rules that the new legislation now bring forward. So by Muslims towing the line,
this legislation are purely being introduced to curb the Muslims, to silence them. So, for
essentially,
example,
so my question would be, why should there be this climate of fear if we're talking about a free, liberal society? Because a minute ago, from your question, you said, look, you have it great here, you can talk.
Yeah, this is to safeguard
But at the same time, we are acknowledging the fact that these masjids are not able to talk. They are being. There's been a lot of pressure that has been applied upon them
due to the legislation. Yes.
Absolutely. So how can you say that it is? This. How can we celebrate this freedom?
So
and then at the same time, we are. Like a victim of legislations very specifically targeted.
Yeah, draconian legislation.
Absolutely.
You could be arrested. You could be taken.
Absolutely.
Your children could be taken away.
So these freedoms, you can talk about it as much as you like. The fact remains that actually there isn't.
So we're not really free. Is that what you're trying to say in this country?
Absolutely, we're not. And we can see this pressure is going to build up even more, because the more Muslims connect with Islam, and the more Muslims talk about Islam, you will find that this naturally becomes a threat for their way of life. And this is why it is very convenient for Western politicians to link any issue like Brussels or Paris to suggest that this is an attack on their way of life.
So listeners are very anxious to know what advice. This is a very important point, I think, for the benefit of the listeners. What advice can you give them so that they don't remain fearful in this climate?
I would say that Muslims generally should not feel that they're a minority. Yes, we may be lesser in number in UK, maybe,
from
or
a population
Europe.
point of view,
From a
minority in
population
Europe.
point of view, yes, we may be a less in number in the West. But we are part of a global ummah. We are a nation of 1.2 billion, is it?
1.2 billion at the moment.
1.2 billion. And we need to connect with our people, our ummah. We are people of the same faith, and we only care for Islam, and we fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We don't fear these draconian laws or the blame of these Western governments and their media. And we need to really, remain who we are, and we need to engage with the wider society. Because I tell you one thing, there are a lot of non-Muslims out there, who are sincere, and they know they know the facts. They know the facts, and they do understand the situation of the Muslims. What is happening here is the West is actually now vilifying the Muslim community as it did to the Jewish community in the past. And if we remain silent, really things are not going to change. It's just, if we duck our head down, the wind isn't just going to blow over us. So we need to deal with it.
Thank you, Nizal.
The passive approach, which the Muslim community for a long time have taken, this has not benefited anyone, really. We've taken that route for so long. And we can see the byproducts of that. The red lines have been pushed further and further constantly. So when we talk about freedom of expression, specifically to the Muslims, and how masjid committees are always under pressure, it's not, many listeners may think, well, surely, of course, you should limit any radical hate preachers. You should do that. Fair enough. But we're not referring to violent extremism. There's a new concept which is non-violent extremism. So there are many aspects of Islam which is viewed as controversial. And a few years ago, these were not viewed as controversial because many other communities agreed with those values and views. But now, unfortunately, these things cannot be mentioned in the masjid as such. So it seems as though different aspects of Islam are now being moulded, and the red lines are being pushed further and further back. And that's a direct result of Muslims from the very first day, from day one, going back to the early 2000s, late 90s. When the first red lines were pushed, we should have made an intellectual response. We did not. We failed to do that. Our leaders in the community generally didn't do much in that regard. They told the non-controversial line of simply saying, Islam is a religion of peace, etc., etc. We've heard all of this before. In spite of that, Islam was, Muslims and Islam still being portrayed as a threat constantly. And, going back to one of the questions before, which is to do with fear in the world. And one of the caller mentioned about we shouldn't trivialize, or you said to the caller, we shouldn't trivialize
this matter.
Yeah, the deaths of people in the Western world. Absolutely, we shouldn't. But we should still have a sense of proportionality. We should look at the reality, which is you have 130 people in Paris dead, right, during the Paris attacks. And I remember within social media itself, lots of people are changing their profile picture to a French flag. And then you saw the politicians coming out, discussing and talking, and you could feel the fervor, you could feel the emotion, the Western radicalization beginning. Now, the issue is, when you have this so-called radicalization in the Muslim community, many of us, we go to the masjid, that I would go as far as to say, not only is radicalization in the Muslim community a minority, it doesn't exist. You go to various masjid, it doesn't exist. Have you ever seen a hate preach in real life? BBC will be able to cherry pick radical preachers with an eye patch, with a hook hand. They'll manage to find these figures and put them on TV, irrespective of how many members or leaders we have who come out and say the same line of Islam's a religion of peace.
I tell you what's been trivialized. What's been trivialized is 500,000 deaths in Iraq.
It's actually 1 million, according to John Pilger.
Absolutely,
1 million people.
It's certainly more than the figures that have been pushed. But what's been trivialized is the death of 1 million Iraqi. Yeah, what's been trivialized is the plight of the Palestinian people. What's been trivialized is the deaths and destruction of the entire Middle East and Syria. These are the things that have been trivialized. So we can talk about death and whatnot, but the thing is, as Muslims here, we value human lives, and all human lives matter, whether they're Muslim or not. But it certainly, cannot be said for Western governments Western politicians and Western media. And this is the point that Muslims really need to understand.
It seems thank you for that. It seems that the community leaders, Muslim community leaders, they're very reluctant to discuss about legitimate foreign policy, constructively discuss and debate, and potentially expose the government on that. Why is it the case that Muslims are not exposing the government's foreign policy, for example? Is it something they should be doing?
Yeah, I think they actually have no excuse. I sincerely believe that they have no excuse, and for us to make excuses for them is again not justified either. I think they really need to be questioned whether they are in a suitable position to remain as community leaders, as we put it. Because if they're not doing what leaders are supposed to do, then really we need the right men to step forward and take charge.
Thank you. I've got another text from a listener. He's saying this: how is the Brussels attack impacted the Muslim community? He said, Darek, can you be very short, please, Nizal?
Yeah, Brussels attack, like any other attack, it's very fearful for the Muslims, not just here, but least of all for the Muslim world, because with these attacks, when you get the heightened Western radicalization that happens across the entire public spectrum, what follows is aggressive policies and further invasions, as we saw in the Paris attack. Following that, you saw the French flags. You saw English football fans singing the French anthem, trying to sing the French anthem in French. And what followed then was, to no surprise, France would go into Syria and launch strikes, which killed in excess way more than 130 people. So obviously we shouldn't measure up, but they killed. This is not playground politics. Absolutely not.
What you're essentially saying is it was a pretext for them to go into Syria.
Absolutely. When I'm not one for conspiracy theories as to who did the attacks, but at the same time, the emotions that developed afterwards were no doubt this was utilized by the government.
Thank you. I've got a question from one of the listeners. This is directed to you, Abdus Samad. He's saying, Brother Abdus Samad, I agree with you. I too agree there's an agenda here. I would like to know, what is it about Islam the West fears so much, and what aspects of Islam don't the Western government want the Muslims of Europe to learn about?
Well, it's obviously, see, the Muslim world, when it was colonized, if you like, by the West, what they did was they dismantled Islam, because they realized Islam was the strength that unified.
When was that? When did that happen? Briefly.
The Islamic Caliphate was actually destroyed, officially abolished in 1924, 3rd of March.
So they've had a long-term influence in the Muslims.
That's right. And prior to that, we had say 1,300 years of Islamic rule. Now, yes, any society has its ups and downs, and but despite all of that, we found that the entire Muslim world was united.
The listener's question is contradictory. He says, what part of Islam? Because I thought they allow you to pray, they allow you masjid, education centers.
This is right. Yeah, so what happened is that when they colonized the Muslim world, they actually interfered with our Islamic education even. They took out aspects and they reformed Islam. And for them to suggest that, Islam needs to go through reformation is...
What do they mean by that?
It's actually a red herring, because Islam at current day, today, Islam is actually in a reformed state. And it is restricted and it's limited to, salah and fasting and good manners and akhlaq and things like this. What they don't want us to discuss about or be concerned about is the political aspects and the ideological aspects of Islam. And these are the things that the Muslims are more and more connecting with in the Muslim world and as well in the West. And this is a threat. Now, why is this a threat?
Politically,
yes, this is a threat because this is the thing that will really liberate the Muslim world, and it will curb the influence and interference of Western powers to go and interfere and exploit the resources and exploit the lands and the people, and have political influence over. And this is what they fear very much. And for this reason, this is why I say they would go to any length. They would go to any length. And this is why I wouldn't be surprised if, for example, these events like Brussels and Paris were actually even orchestrated
I hope the listeners got his answer clearly. That is the political aspect of Islam.
So this is what I mean. I would encourage the Muslim community to really, go back to history, learn their history, and learn the political aspects, and revive this whole concept of ummah and khilafah and things like this.
Thank you. Would you want to add anything before?
Yes. So what I would say is there's a common misconception that keeps it's always there in the background, and that is when we look at we say the Western world and the Islamic world, or the so-called Islamic world, the Muslim world as it exists today. We can't equate brown leaders as Muslim leaders. We can't equate cream-colored skin, Arab leaders as Muslim leaders or Islamic leaders. There is a distinction. Unfortunately, in the Western world, Islamic is just is a pseudonym for dictators. Unfortunately, so in the Western world, there's a binary ones and zero. Sort of yin yang kind of mentality of opposites, which is on the one hand you have democracy, capitalism, on the other hand you've got dictatorship, Islam, blah blah blah, and so on. But the reality is, what we have in the Muslim world, you can take any example in different regions of the Muslim world. You've got Ikhwan al-Muslimin in Egypt as an example. You've got a secular government in Egypt, and there's an opposition between the two. Now, from a simplistic Western point of view, Ikhwan al-Muslimin, Islamic, Mubarak, the secular government in Egypt,
Sisi at the moment.
That's right. They're all part of they're all part of the same thing. They're all part of the same construct. But in reality, it's not the case. Many of the dictators in the Muslim world, the most iconic even, such as Saddam Hussein, were secular. Saddam Hussein was secular. Colonel Gaddafi was secular. All that what's happening in Syria right now, President Assad, it is not a Sunni Shia fight. He's actually a socialist. So you find most of them are very secular.
Okay, thank you for that. I've got another text. It says, "Is it odd that the mainstream media so quickly reported that ISIS took full responsibility for these attacks?" Abdus Samad, very quickly.
Yeah, well, God knows who ISIS is. Yeah, they seem to be in very close contact with the Western governments. That they get updates very quickly. So like I said, a lot of people may say that I'm a conspiracy theorist, but
now, to be fair with you, I mean, I've seen a lot of Western think tanks are saying
exactly. There's a lot of Western thinkers, Western people who are very clued up with the politics, And like the interesting thing is, if all the declassified information, leaked declassified information suggests that the West has done in the past, gone to great lengths to sort of like what do you call it, to pull out political stunts, then what makes us think that it can't do it today?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Definitely. Thanks for that. Should the Muslim community have anything to be ashamed of? Because a lot of people after the attack came forward and apologized and condemned. We've discussed that any life is important, it's sacred. So should Muslims be ashamed, Nizal, and come forward and apologize?
I think this apologetic style of discussion it's been used too much now. I mean, obviously we still have to categorically, we need to make it clear and plain that Islam opposes this, but I can't imagine any non-Muslims...
Islam opposes the killing of Muslims in Iraq, for example.
Of course.
Killing of Muslims in Syria.
That's it. I mean, but the issue is, overall, we should move away from this apologetic stance. We've done this for too long. And in spite of that, in spite of Labour Party being in power, in spite of Conservatives being in power, irrespective of which politicians your masjid committee brings into the masjid, the media has still been very much creating this image of Islam being a threat, Muslims being a threat, even though you and I, all of us here, and our listeners as well, the Muslims who are listening, we've always been too apologetic. That's the issue. The entire focus should not be about the nature of Islam. It should not be. The discussion should never even be about Islam. Why did these terrorists do this? They are saying why they did it. It's plain and clear to see. They're saying why they do it. That's not a justification for it, absolutely not. But at the same time, that gives us the platform for discussion.
Yeah, even if they, I can't stop but say this, that even if they say they've done it, they claim so-called, we really don't know what happened, what is happening in the ground, you see. Despite,
the thing is, even if ISIS did do it,
So,
You know,
so what?
Why have I got to apologize?
Absolutely.
What have I got to apologize for?
see.
You know, it's ridiculous. I mean, have the British government apologized for killing 500,000?
Yeah, Mr.
1
Blair,
million
did he
Iraqis?
apologize?
Did they apologize? Do the ordinary British public apologize for that?
I think following from that, it's a really important concept is a sense of proportionality, which is you find whichever groups it may be, whether ISIS or whichever other group, they are a minority essentially, and whenever attacks take place against the Muslim world or against a Muslim country, the response is never by Muslim governments. So this notion of the West versus the Islamic world, this notion of the West versus the Muslim world, it doesn't exist. You know, there's never,
Absolutely.
whenever during the Iraq War, there was never a collective response from Muslim governments. It doesn't exist. However, on the other hand, when you have a killing of 130 people in Paris, you know the civilians in Syria and Iraq are going to feel the full force of America. They're going to feel the full force of France. They're going to feel the full force of Belgium and the UK. And these are governments. These aren't, you know, the collective organized effort of governments who have taxes behind them, who have a military infrastructure behind them, who are flying, you know, aircraft that are $60 million US, you know, without any payload even. You know, one of these missiles is £90,000.
Even a lot of non-Muslims I've heard say that this is all a pretext. It's an inside job. ISIS is an inside job, etc. These are non-Muslims saying no.
Exactly.
To clarify, it's not just the Muslims. Some Muslims. There's a lot of non-Muslims who say that. Abdus Samad, how will Islamic governments respond to the demonization of Muslims and Islam in the world media?
You mean if there was an Islamic government?
Yeah, you were referring to a political, ideological entity. Can you elaborate on that, and how would that respond to this type of demonization?
Well, it would certainly challenge the narrative that is being pushed out from the Western world.
So you effectively bring it to debate, bring
yes.
roundtable.
It will have its
debate
own
on this
media.
issue.
It will have its own media in place. It will, seek to unify the Muslim world and
because on a state level, what could
because
you do?
One of the things is at the moment there isn't a representation of Islam, and in its absence you find anybody will make some justification or some sort of link to some Islamic text to justify certain crime, as an example. Now, what do you have in the West? What you have is that you will have some far right that will talk about their constitution, or misread or misquote their constitution to justify certain killing or certain. Do you see? Now we know the courts or the common public will disagree with these far right extreme view, but they are also citing their constitution. Do you see? So in the absence of an Islamic body, an Islamic state, an Islamic government, Islamic courts, you find anybody can make any sort of link with Islam and then carry out any sort of atrocity. But there's no one to sort of like challenge that or question.
So what you're essentially saying, as a state internationally,
if we had an Islamic state, for example, an Islamic government, the Islamic courts, they will apply their ruling, and they will tell you that these people are, misquoting Islam, because the authority of Islam and the courts and the ordinary people will reject these sort of views and opinions. Do you see?
Nizal, do you have anything else to add on this point?
Yeah, what I would say is, even with the absence of a true Islamic state, we're not referring to ISIS obviously, but even with the absence of a proper khilafah, what you find is, by and large, however much the image of ISIS has been inflated, by and large, Muslims do not have sympathy towards that direction. But at the same time, what we find threatening, what's very, very threatening in the world is when there's a Western fanaticism that develops, when there's people waving candles in the sky and waving flags, and the government media, the media outlets are promoting war, essentially. They sponsor this idea of victimization of the West at the hands of a few terrorists, and the inevitable result is a further war, further invasions. It's usually on a much bigger scale, a huge scale. It usually results in more lives being lost. We have to have that sense of proportionality, and the fear I always have whenever there's an attack in the West is that, first of all, no innocents deserve to die, whether Muslim or non-Muslim. Absolutely. But at the same time, I know at the same time, that's going to lead to, whenever there's a terrorist attack here, there's going to be bigger attacks in the Muslim world.
Jazakallah khair. We've come to the end of the show, unfortunately. I would love to carry on with the discussion. Unfortunately, we're restrained by time. So thank you very much for joining, listening to the show. And until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Middle Path Radio, your number one online Islamic talk station.